Hi everyone and welcome back to another perfect pairing. Are you currently paralyzed by the pristine page, that crippling fear of ruining a brand new sketchbook? Same. That's why today we're ignoring the rules and diving into a mixed media journal spread. We're turning ink, mess, and oops moments into something meaningful. Let's get creative. Alright, let's rip the band-aid off. I'm using the new A5 Luxe Watercolor Sketchbook. I chose the A5 size because it fits in with the rest of my planners, notebooks of the same size. I'm taking off the clear protective packaging and the cigar band holding the book closed. I'm going to encourage the watercolor signatures of the sketchbook to lay flat, so I'm taking one page from the beginning and one page at the end. I'll gently lay each page open to help the spine flex a little bit. Okay, after procrastinating and avoiding the matter at hand, let's start not on the cover page, but the first full watercolor page spread. This is how I comfortably avoid blank page syndrome. Maybe you'll want to throw a title on the first page, but I'm not ready for that. I'm using the paper band packaging to protect the watercolor pages from these binder clips. This will help keep my pages open. First, let's pick one of the main elements to the page spread. This is Lenten Grace Stamp and Stencil Bundle. I love the pairing of the hellebore images in two sizes. I plan for these images to fill the majority of the pages in this spread. To stamp this first large hellebore cluster, I'll use just the flip plate to the original stamp wheel as my mount for the photopolymer stamp. I'll use Earthy Rose fresh dye ink from Earthy Embrace family of inks to stamp this outline. I had a failed first impression due to the uneven surface and tried to realign the stamp, and unfortunately this led to my first fail. Literally the first thing I stamp on my sketchbook and it's ugly. So I'm going to trust the process and not give up, which I'm not gonna lie, I almost did start all over and pretended like this never happened. To fix this, I'm going to do a few things. First, I'm going to use the Better Press platform since it's roughly the same thickness as the remaining pages in the sketchbook, and this should give me a more sturdy surface to stamp on. Next, I'll use Obsidian Pigment Ink to get a cleaner impression. I'll try my best to align the original outline to the previous two failed attempts. I was happy with this, but I don't know what to do with the remaining ghost outlines I had on this page. I'll move on from this and stamp other clusters of the large hellebore image, as well as the smaller clusters, all in Obsidian Pigment Ink. Finally, I'm going to make some bold outline choices with the Unifying liner pens. I'll start with the 05 fine liner pen, but ultimately I switched to the Flex Calligraphy Pen Set in the large and medium nibs. I'm making the deliberate choice to make varying line widths with the flexible nib of the calligraphy pens. The more pressure you apply, the thicker the line weight. I used this to my advantage by hiding the ghost stamping of the Earthy Rose outline. I also mirrored this variation in line width on the remaining petal images and leaf images throughout this spread, making sure that I create consistent coverage between both pages. Now, I was still feeling very unsure about my choice to keep going with the spread. I kind of had to let go of the perfection and let this sketchbook become an exercise of freedom. For the exposed flower centers, I switched to the medium flex nib and got a general outline of the flower center, not focusing on every anther, but rather an outline of the entire shape. At this point where I thought, if I gave up on this page now, I would have already wasted about half an hour, so again, I made every effort to keep going. I'm going to bring back Earthy Rose fresh dye ink and a large ink blending tool to distress the edges of this page. I also wanted to add a warm tone to the hellebore images. I deepened some areas with toasted paprika, also from Earthy Embrace. Now I'll bring in the stencil set for Lenten Grace. Instead of coloring these images with an array of Altenews fresh dye inks and a blending brush, I wanted an unconventional approach to coloring these petals. After all, I went from a more realistic feeling spread to one that felt more like a preliminary sketch with bold graphic outlines. I thought more texture in the spread was going to be better in the end. To color the openings of the stencil that matched the outlines of Lenten Grace, I used the Mint Gardener Watercolor Compact in Deep Muse. I love the warmer tones of this palette, and I thought it would perfectly match and set the mood for the other future elements I have planned in this spread. In order to avoid the botanical illustration like watercolor I very much enjoy, I grabbed the Artist's Watercolor Foundation Brush Set and the 3/4 angled brush, and I'll use this brush to fill in the open areas of the stencil with watercolor. This will lead to another mistake and another lesson learned. Wet washes of watercolor will travel underneath the stencil, causing pigment to flow outside the lines. So I had to really use just enough water to hydrate the pigment and almost dry brush the watercolor through the stencil, just to stay within the lines. In the end, I loved that this choice to use the watercolor brush captured a lot of brush strokes, the texture of the watercolor paper, and also created so much movement in the petals. So another happy accident on this spread. I used lilac burgundy on the larger hellebore cluster and raspberry rose on the smaller clusters. For the leaves and flower centers, I used origin umber, mossy oak, and golden ochre. The intent for the watercolor was to act as a toned base for some upcoming mediums. I wanted fairly solid washes of color without it being so exact like a photograph. Again, dry brushing the pigment and then removing the stencil was the most satisfying reveal during this whole process, and even still, after watercoloring, I felt like this spread needed a little something. The acrylic markers were the perfect solution to add more painted strokes and impressionism details to the spread. It still let me create that botanical illustration feel without the exact replication of a floral image. The Volume 2 set of acrylic markers perfectly matched the tone of the rest of the watercolors and ink-blended details. I grabbed markers to add directional strokes and details to the petals. I still wanted the textured watercolor to shine through the acrylic markers, so I didn't try to fully cover the watercolor. I added just enough paint to color block on the petals. For the foliage, I used warm green tones and markers to add more saturated color. I wanted more organic shapes and blocks of color on the foliage, not paying so much attention to shading. Every once in a while, I added dot details with the acrylic markers to the flower centers and the petals of the hellebores to mimic the freckled texture of real hellebores. I loved the end result of all of these layers of color, and now I figured I'd stop while I'm ahead. In order to unite the scene, I wanted to continue the flow of organic shapes throughout the spread. Water Builder Stencil was the perfect way to create organic shapes and the connection between the hellebore images. I've used Frosted Sea Glass fresh dye ink from Coastal Mist family of inks and a mini ink blending tool to add areas of blue between the hellebores. I like a good page title, something that ties in with other focal images in a journal spread. Creative Labels Sentiment Set is the perfect addition to this page. Aside from the beautiful typeface featured on the stamp set, there are other embellishment shapes that I love in the set as well. I'll add solid blocks of organic shapes and color with Chasing Shadows family of ink. The foliage images and creative labels are perfect for filling and connecting the foreground hellebores. Then with the Slotted Circle stamp and Frosted Sea Glass, I'll add my first geometric shape to balance this arrangement. I also added the rows of X's to various open areas, and it was the perfect embellishment for this spread. Finally, I'll use Obsidian Pigment Ink to stamp the grateful and "You mean the world to me" sentiments onto this page on top of the slotted circle image. Almost done with the spread, I'm adding jet black and pure white ink spray splatters to finish this set. I love how the jet black ink spray perfectly unified the whole arrangement, but unfortunately I made another boo-boo. I was ambitious with the splatter and ended up covering my sentiment. Oops again. In order to cover up this mistake yet again, I used the fine liner pen to create these geometric blocks to shorten the sentiment, and it happened to work perfectly and kept the meaning of the sentiment. I felt like these geometric blocks also tied in with the rest of the X's and other shapes that are on this spread. Next time, I'll remember to cover my sentiment while splattering. I always get too confident. After adding more X's, I'll adhere the pictures of my cats. I use an inkless printer to get these images, and I've just been holding on to these. This journaling page happened to perfectly fit all 4 of my cat pictures. Then after adding the photos, I added more X stamps and wrote in a little bit of journaling to the page with the finest fine liner pen. Looking at the spread now, you'd never know it started with a failed stamp and a mini panic attack. But that's the beauty of a junk journal. It's a safe harbor for mistakes. By the time I added the photos of my cats and those final ink splatters, all of those oops moments just became layers of a story. So if you're staring at a blank page today, I'm giving you permission to mess it up. Stamp the wrong thing, smudge the ink, and just keep going. You might find that your fixes end up being your favorite part.